Nima fell to a knee, grasping tight around the deep wound in her thigh, trying to staunch the blood, while Bruckner surveyed his own injury. The cut across his ribs was not too deep, though it would need seeing to. Nima's raven cawed from a nearby stand of birch as though to announce that the immediate danger had passed. Bruckner turned to Nima, ignoring the cut across his ribs for the moment.
You fought bravely. How is your wound?
He scanned the area for somewhere to shelter from the rain.
You fought not only bravely, but effectively.
Nima responded and added with a wry smile.
I suppose the answer to your question depends on what sort of adventurers we wish to be. If I had to guess, I would imagine that you are more likely to wish us to be the enduring and silently suffering type. So I suppose I will say that my wound is quite fine. Nothing wrong at all, really.
So saying, she attempted to stand and nearly fell over as she put weight on the injured leg.
Do you need a potion?
Bruckner asked, trying to steady her.
Come, we should take cover in that copse. Your bird is there, see?
Canary.
Interjected Nima.
Beg pardon?
The raven. I decided to call him Canary.
Bruckner considered this, then shrugged.
It is your bird.
He helped her make her way to the stand of trees where the raven waited. Nima found it difficult to bear her weight and nearly fell on the slick turf. Bruckner, however, bore her up and helped her along, getting both to the copse of birch trees. The newly christened canary sailed down from an upper branch, alighting on Nima's shoulder. It cawed as if in alarm to see the blood on her clothing and nuzzled its head against her cheek. The little stand of trees was far from dry, though the leaves above provided some shelter from the elements. Nima sat gingerly and began dressing and binding up the wound. Slowly, she sipped from one of the restorative vials of magical medicine to aid her body in healing swiftly and fully. While Nima rested, Bruckner quickly looked over the knoll corpses in case the beast carried anything helpful. He saw nothing to indicate that this was anything other than the normal sort of attack made by such wicked and desperate creatures on a regular basis. Still, it sat uneasily with him that such monsters as these would have ventured so close to a city as large as Amenia. The two hench gnolls possessed nothing but rusting scimitars and poorly fashioned iron shields. Their leather armor was of exceedingly poor make. When Bruckner examined the nearly bisected corpse of the leader, however, his eye fell upon the bow the beast had been wielding so inaccurately. The workmanship of the bow was unfamiliar to Bruckner, but it was clearly a piece of quality. It was formed from a limb of some pale wood that Bruckner had never seen before. It was covered in subtle carvings, some strange symbology etched in lines of crimson and jet. The quiver of arrows that the monster carried was further evidence that this was no gnoll-made weapon. At the chieftain's belt was a ragged coin purse. Inside were some 24 smallish gold coins of unfamiliar mint. Bruckner took the bow and the quiver along with the purse. Returning to the copse, he counted out half of the coins and handed them to Nima.
Here, your part,
he said. She thanked him, a note of surprise in her voice.
Can you use the bow? I don't shift with ranged weapons.
He set the bow and quiver before her and began cleaning his sword.
I'm afraid I'm not large enough to use a bow like that. Perhaps we should hang on to it and sell it when we get a chance?
Bruckner nodded.
We should make camp here.
The rain was still increasing, becoming a torrential downpour, and there appeared to be no better camping spots than this solitary copse of trees anywhere in sight. Nima agreed. The elf maid proved the more adept survivalist of the two, having had more experience living out of doors. She guided the swordsman through the construction of a shelter and taught him how to make a fire during a rainstorm. In her own shelter, she concluded by setting up a small nest of her traveling cloak for her bird to sleep in. It took some time, but working together over a hand drill and fireboard, the adventurers soon had a healthy blaze going. They stocked it well with wood, and then, each one being exhausted from so singular a day, Bruckner and Nima each bedded down and fell swiftly asleep. Both were too tired to think of setting a watch. Soon they were dead to the world. Bruckner awoke briefly during the night to discover that the rain had stopped. The fire was reduced to a bed of smoldering coals. He built it back up, relieved himself, then lay back down, his entire body aching from the beating he had taken on the docks and the fight the night before. Soon he was drifting back to sleep, watching the fire grow into a healthy blaze. For a moment, Bruckner thought perhaps he heard the rustle of wet leaves or the squelch of mud, But then sleep took him, and he could reflect on it no further. Some hours later, Nima awoke from dark dreams. She shivered in the night cold and clutched her cloak about her. She was vaguely aware that the fire was burning quite bright and hot, more than it should have been, it seemed to her. She dimly recalled Bruckner tossing some additional logs onto the fire during the night, but that must have been hours ago. She sat up, filled with a sudden alarm, and there was Bruckner, fast asleep, clutching his sword and snoring softly. Then Nima's heart skipped a beat as she spied a very small figure sitting next to the flames, warming their hands and knees and tossing new bits of wood every now and then onto the roaring pile. Breathing as quietly as a corpse, Nima studied the tiny figure. He had not yet looked her way or noticed her noticing him. He was humming a little tune as he warmed himself before the fire. The creature was a gnome, Nima realized. He appeared to have no manifestly evil intentions towards herself or Bruckner, she thought. Indeed, for all the world, it appeared that the little fellow was just passing the time until morning. Nima rose silently to her feet in a crouched position. The little gnome did not hear her, so intent was he on a new game, which consisted of skipping in a circle around the fire while juggling several stones. Sneaking through the shadows, Nima wove a circle around the dancing interloper. Snaking an arm out from behind a birch tree, she placed her bundled cloak softly over Bruckner's face, then gently kicked him in the ribs as she passed. Bruckner woke with a soft "Ugh!" that was muffled by Nima's cloak. After a moment's struggle, he emerged from the cloth draped over him and was about to demand an explanation when he spied Nima creeping toward a small figure frolicking before the campfire. Nima positioned herself in the darkest shadows just beyond the rim of firelight, waiting for the small, skipping person to turn his back to her. The moment he did, Nima struck, leaping forward and grabbing the tiny figure with one arm, raising her dagger in the other hand to rest against the throat of her little prisoner.
I'll have your name and your reason for being here,
Nima hissed in the gnome's ear. As she did so, Bruckner rose, gripping his sword. The little fellow squirmed and kicked and began to yell loudly.
Help! Bandits! Help! Bandits and miscreants! Let me go, you turpentine-bellied curmudgeon! You'll not get away with this, you won't. I'm a citizen, and under the protection of the gods, misguided though they may be. Help! Help! You foul, misguided, liver-faced pool of malicious insurrection, let me go!
He kicked Nima sharply in the shin with his flailing heels, continuing to shout for help in a rather small and silly voice. He was flailing wildly, and though he had plenty of energy, seemed a little threat. Canary squawked loudly, fluttering out of the lean-to, awoken by the commotion. The little gnome continued shouting in his tiny voice. Bruckner strode up to stand next to Nima and her captive, but did not draw his sword.
She asked you a question, gnome. Who are you? And why have you helped yourself to our camp?
The gnome stared up at Bruckner, seemingly shocked into silence, then twisted his head to look up at Nima.
All right, you brigands, he panted. No need for all the rough stuff. Why did I help myself to your camp? Because it was warm and I was a-freezing. Now let me go, you wicked thing.
He kicked against Nima with all the force of his tiny legs.
A lucky thing you found us, then, and not a pack of gnolls. What are you doing wandering in the woods in the dark and cold?
What cheek?
The tiny fellow said, continuing to drive his heels into Nima's legs. The blows did not hurt. Even by gnome standards, this fellow was very small.
Why, I'm traveling to put an end to the evil in these parts. Surely even so evil a pair as you two have heard of it. There are devils wandering about, and I aim to put a stop to it, I do.
He glared up at Bruckner from fast within Nima's embrace with fierce determination. His eyes were slightly wonky as though caught in a perpetual cross.
Now you!
He shouted back at Nima.
Let me go!
Nima released the gnome such that his momentum carried him a few feet away from her, then held her dagger aloft in case he decided to retaliate. The tiny fellow careened forward a bit as Nima suddenly released him onto his windmilling legs. Nima stifled a chuckle. Catching his balance rather comically by flailing his arms, he turned back to glare at Nima. He sniffed imperiously, then began straightening his tunic and cloak.
In return for the hospitality you have stolen from us, you will tell us to what evil you are referring, and how it is, precisely, that you intend to stop it.
He ignored her, still fussing over his clothing. She studied him in the meantime. He appeared to be a young adult gnome, perhaps in his mid-40s, with abundant straw-colored curls, a snub nose, and bright, albeit slightly crossed eyes. He wore traveling gear that had evidently seen some time on the road already. He finished preening himself, which he seemed to be doing with deliberate slowness, then said in a squeaky voice, as though there had been no pause between Nima's question and his answer,
Well, I thought it should be quite obvious what I was doing. I'm looking for these devils who've bewitched the king and thrown the region into turmoil. As for how I'll do it, don't be daft, thickhead. I'll use my magics.
He raised a hand and a jet of fire shot upward from his fingertips. Nima turned away from the gnome, saying,
Use your magics to make your own fire, then, and leave ours be.
She walked a few steps in the direction of the shelter and then stopped.
You mentioned in your ravings that you are under the protection of some gods. What gods would those be?
At Nima's question, the gnome brightened and said enthusiastically,
All the gods love Tadalak Wishmere, little sister.
He leapt into the air, landing on one hand in a silly sort of handstand. He balanced that way for a moment, seemingly content to ignore Nima's recommendation that he make his own fire, and looked at Bruckner.
You're a quiet one, but big enough. Big and quiet.
He alighted back to his feet, a silly grin dawning upon his face.
Big and quiet, just like an ox. I shall call you Ox.
He began to caper about, singing a song that went like this.
He always wins and ne'er looks back. Tadalak, Tadalak.
And more in that vein.
Which devils are they, Wishmere?
Bruckner asked impatiently, interrupting the gnome's song.
Which devils? What a question, Ox. Why do you ask? Are some devils amenable to you and others detestable? Are not devils devils?
The little gnome's face grew slowly serious and his laughter dried up.
They are bad devils, swordsman Ox, from the 9 hells, methinks, and they will prove work for your blade aplenty.
The gnome's suddenly serious demeanor cracked abruptly into more laughter. He turned a cartwheel, then began dancing a jig, exclaiming,
Oh, yes, Tadalak and his new sidekicks will have their work cut out for them.
Stop prancing about like a Zazarite slaver's monkey. Do you know anything of these devils? Where did you hope to find them?
The little gnome reluctantly ceased his capering.
Ox has a short temper, and an even shorter sense of taste for good dancing. But it is all the same to Tadalak. The rumors I have heard lead me north from Amenia. King Janison is the key now. He is the only one I know of to have had personal communication with the demons. So I seek him. Information is scarce, but that does not stop Tadalak. Where does Ox and little sister go?
Tadalak turned to Nima with wide, serious eyes. Bruckner studied the sky. It was nearing dawn. The morning star glinted through a veil of mist, and the dark sky showed hints of gray at the edges. He began unwrapping some rations for breakfast, then turned to Tadalak.
You are welcome to some food if you're hungry. After that, your business is your own, but you cannot travel with us. We move quickly and we can ill afford to protect you.
Ignoring Tadalak's question, Nima listened to Bruckner with a disapproving look. She opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it, returning instead to the shelter to partake of some of her own rations. Tadalak turned up his nose to Bruckner.
I have my own food, Ox. Besides, oxen food is not for gnomes. You think too little of Tadalak, though, if you think he would need protecting. My magics are quite strong, and my knowledge of the gods ensures that I have no need of other friends.
He seemed hurt. He strode past Bruckner to Nima and patted her on the leg.
Thanks for not stabbing me, little sister. I'm sorry I stole some of your fire's heat. If you change your mind and decide you want Tadalak's help in battle and in all things divine, I am heading north, following the will of the gods.
He began to walk away slowly, northward out of the clearing. Bruckner finished his breakfast, then packed and began erasing the signs of their camp.
We should continue our journey.
Nima stood in silence until Tadalak was out of earshot. Then she said to Bruckner that she would be right back, and ran to catch up with the gnome. When she was level with him, she walked beside him and said,
You keep mentioning the gods, but you aren't being very specific. Tell me now, is it true that there is a deity whose will you are doing and who will reward you for your services?
The gnome smiled upon seeing Nima and listened carefully as she spoke. When she had finished, he replied with unexpected seriousness. The vast majority of his previous flippancy and childishness was gone.
Well, little sister, my relationship with the gods is complex. I study wizardry, you see, and don't do much by way of prayer or service to the gods, but I do know much and more about them. I've made a lifelong study of the gods, you see, and I know what sorts of things they do and don't do, their tastes and discords, like that. What's your interest?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but studying the gods isn't the same as being in their service. Are you saying that because you have studied what the gods will, you are assuming that what you are doing is in their service? Which gods have commanded you to root out the evil in this land? You speak of all the gods. It was my understanding that the will of the various gods hardly overlaps.
I don't know that I ever said I was in the service of the gods, my love. Just that I was under their protection, like all things in the world. Perhaps that was misleading.
He shrugged.
At any rate, I am in favor of the good, and though I know the habits and demeanors of all the gods, I favor Arunar, Virion, Baldric, you know.
He broke into a silly grin.
All the bright and shiny ones. If you seek to know more about them, I can help, to be sure.
Nima frowned and looked at the ground.
Well, I suppose at some point I may desire some further information. Tell me where you are going, and I can keep an eye out for you if our paths cross again.
Tadalak smiled.
I'm heading north, as I said, seeking information on King Janison and these wretched devils and fiends, if that's what they are.
With amazing dexterity, the gnome leapt into the air and kissed Nima on the cheek. He landed, bowing with a flourish.
Don't worry, little sister. You will see Tadalak again.
With that, the gnome was off, singing some nonsensical song. Nima headed back to where she had left Bruckner, using her handkerchief and some water to scrub her cheek.
What were you speaking about with the gnome?
Nothing in particular, just asking where he was headed.